Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is the impact of COVID-19 on India. According to official data, India's COVID-19 death toll topped the 50,000 mark on Monday, and the total number of recorded cases neared 2.65 million as the outbreak spread further into smaller towns and rural areas. This is bad enough, but a Reuters report headlined COVID smashes Indian middle-class dreams indicates that the pandemic is also taking a toll on the economy. India's economy had already slowed down under Narendra Modi's government, as indicated by multiple Indian economists. Former Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh had penned an op-ed advising the government what to do. Other analysts noted that while Mr. Modi was flexing his muscles in the region, the economy was suffering. Ironically, as noted by some, Modi's rise had much to do with the Gujarat model. He failed to replicate it after becoming the Prime Minister. Smart cities, higher growth, better infrastructure, clean drinking water, and much else have fallen by the wayside. Even on the foreign policy front, relations have deteriorated with almost every neighbor, including Nepal and Bangladesh. As many of our Indian guests on this program have noted, this is a cause for concern. Internally, while the economy suffers and the handling of COVID raises questions, the ideological base of the Sangh has grown steadily. Our discussion today would seek to figure out what is happening and why. We are joined by Professor Arun Kumar, an economist based in Delhi, and Professor Steve Keen, an Australian economist and author who joins us from Thailand. Professor Kumar, let me begin with you, but here are some of the figures. The Indian GDP was growing at between 7 to 8% for the past few years, and it was considered the fastest rate in the world. But in the last year, it has been decelerating markedly. The growth rate slumped to 4.5% in the third quarter of 2019, the slowest in 6 years. So the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD have all been sounding the alarm bells. But some of the things that analysts talk about is weak banking and finance sectors saddled with too much bad debt. Then they say that much of the demand for credit has been picked up by the so-called non-banking financial corporations, but they also have their own issues. Then Modi's plan to raise the economic contribution of manufacturing from 15% to 25% of GDP is not making much progress. It has partly been held back by other BJP reforms, such as the goods and service tax system introduced in 2017. Then again, of course, there is the problem of the lackluster global economic performance also, further complicated by COVID-19 everywhere. And then there's the issue of unemployment. So over to you, sir, to give us a sense of what's happening and how it's likely to pan out.
So, you raised several issues together. The first is the economy indeed was slowing down for about 10 quarters, and, in the last quarter of last year, it had slowed down to 3.1%. And the reason was that the unorganized sector in the Indian economy, which employs 94% of the workforce and produces 45% of the output, has been suffering grievously since the time of demonetization in 2016 November. And then, the next shock came when the GST was introduced in July 2017. And then in September 2018, the non-banking financial crisis, hit the Indian economy very hard because they are the ones which do consumer finance and finance of the small and the marginal sector. They are like the shadow banks of India. So in a sense, one after the other, there were three big shocks which impacted the unorganized sector especially hard. And therefore, the demand in the Indian economy was slowing down. And because of that, capacity utilization by, about September 2019 had come down to 70%. And consumer confidence had also dipped. And that's why the rate of growth of the economy had continued to slip quarter by quarter. Now, when the pandemic came, the economy was not doing very well at that time. And pandemic meant that, imposition of lockdown from around the end of March. And it was a very hard lockdown. So people could not move. And when you can't move, you can't go to office, you can't go to factories, then production slumps. So the economy declined during lockdown by about 75%. And therefore, the rate of growth fell very sharply in April. and then it recovered slightly in May, June, but still is about 50% of GDP. And therefore, all predictions are that the rate of growth for the first quarter would be something much less than minus 20%. So the Indian economy, which was already facing headwinds, has suddenly faced this headwind of the pandemic. And in that, of course, as you said, foreign trade has declined. Exports have come down, imports have come down even more sharply. So even though there's a surplus in the trade account in the month of May, but the point is that the demand from the external sector has also declined. So Indian economy has been hit by both external factors and by internal factors. But at the moment, it's the pandemic and the post-pandemic impact on the economy that is really hurting the Indian economy. Unemployment was already down because, as I said, the unorganized sector employs 94% of the workforce, and that was down very badly. Now, in the COVID period with the lockdown, agriculture can work. But the problem was that the food from agriculture could not come into the cities, and therefore you had scenes of rotting fruits and vegetables. So the perishables were going down, and even the non-perishables, their prices came down. So even the farmers suffered. So even though we had a record crop in the month of April, May, what is called the Kharif crop in India, but the problem was that, a lot of that crop did not move to the market. So even agriculture suffered. And therefore, people in agriculture, employed in agriculture, they also suffered quite substantially. So all told, there's unemployment, there's decline in output, and as a result, investment has come down very badly. All this is leading to headwinds. And let me say that services sector, where people have to come in contact, there are some services that can be done at a distance, but a lot of services require people to be close to each other. And those are the services that are suffering, whether it be hotels or airlines or transportation or, many other services like salons and barbers and things like that. So all told, services sector, which is 55% of GDP, that has not been able to come up, though agriculture and manufacturing have come up somewhat. But on the whole, I think the rate of growth will be down by some like 30-40% in this quarter, the first quarter of the current year.
Correct. That sets the background. Thank you so much for that. I'll, of course, return to you, Professor Kumar, with a couple of other questions. But what you're saying, according to the ILO figures, about at least 400 million Indian workers at risk of falling deeper into poverty. I guess, this is a figure which is part of the 94% that you're talking about in the informal sector. And the Indian economy's forecast is likely to shrink by 4.5% this year. But let me pull in Professor Keen here. Professor Keen, you've been on the program previously also. We've had these discussions. And you have your own critique of how, the economic relations in this world have been configured. So there is the pandemic issue. Would you like to give a general comment on how this is going to pan out, or do you want to also talk about certain specifics with reference to India?
Well, what we really have here with the COVID virus is something which inverts the usual thing that causes economic crises. It's normally the finance sector causing disturbances in the real economy. And Marx put this very nicely by dividing the economy into two circuits. He talked about the circuit of commodities, which is where you have commodities to sell. You raise money to buy other commodities, so you're not trying to accumulate a surplus there. And that's about 70% of the economy. It's pretty much what consumers do. They sell their labour, they buy goods with the labour to stay alive, and on the cycle goes. The other circuit is money to commodities to more money. And that's where you are investing, you're speculating, and normally that's the volatile side that falls over. That's about 30% of the economy. What's happening with COVID is, rather than the crisis occurring in the MCM plus circuit, which is the usual thing, it's occurring in the CMC, the commodities to money to commodity. People simply can't they can't sell their labour to earn an income. They haven't got the cash flow to buy the commodities. And that actually makes it a larger crisis than a normal financial crisis, because rather than 30% of the economy slowing down and affecting the remaining 70%, which is more stable, the 70% side is falling. And that's why we're seeing falls of the order of 20 to 40% of GDP across the globe. This is something which a market economy really can't cope with. And in that situation, at least to provide the cash flows, if not the goods and services, the government sector has to step in.
Right. But the issue is that the government sector also does not have enough liquidity. I mean, that's a huge problem. So if they have to step in, how much can they really do to shore up things?
Actually, where our understandings are incorrect, and that's one reason I'm not actually a member of the modern monetary theory group, but I'm a fan of how they explain how government services are financed. And I can make an analogy from how banks create money. We know banks create money by lending more than they get out in deposits. That's how debt is created, private sector debt, which is my main specialty. But the government creates money by simply running a deficit. If the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it's injecting the difference into private bank accounts, and simultaneously that money turns up on the asset side of the banking sector. So when the government issues bonds, it's not to actually raise the money from the finance sector, which could imply a shortage of money for the government. It's to give the finance sector another way to hold the money the government has already created by running the deficit. Rather than having reserves which earn no income, they offer the finance sector bonds which generate an income. It doesn't actually finance the government. So long as the government is willing to run a deficit, it can create the money it needs for this exercise. The bonds are an afterthought. So thinking they're actually necessary to raise the money for the government is simply wrong in terms of accounting. If we get that in our heads, the government can create the deficit, and it should create that deficit right now to provide the cash flow the private sector itself can no longer generate.
Now, this has become deeply technical, so I'm going to throw this to Professor Kumar for his comments with reference to what Professor Keene has said in terms of what the government can do.
So, as was being said by Professor Keene, the government needs to spend because the private sector demand is way short. And therefore, the expenditures of the government, when they're in excess of the taxes and the revenues that are collected by the government, then that's pumping in additional demand in the economy. And that's the deficit of the government. Now, the government's deficit in India is running at a very high level because last year the deficit was already running at about 10% of GDP. Because if you take the states and the center and the public sector together, now the GDP is going to fall by, say, 30 or 40%. Then that becomes almost 15% GDP as a deficit. Further, because the economy is down, and especially those sectors, the non-essential sectors where the indirect taxes are high and where most of the indirect taxes are collected from. So therefore, the tax GDP ratio will fall. That means the tax collection will fall. And I suspect the tax collection will fall to about half of what was collected last year. So that will raise the deficit further unless the government cuts back expenditures. And then the third thing is that the government needs to spend extra for medical expenses, for taking care of the poor. And my estimate is about 200 million people have lost employment, especially from the unorganized sector. But the CMIE data suggests that, about 14 million from the organized sector have also lost employment. So therefore, even direct tax collection will fall. And when tax collection falls and people go below the poverty line, then the government needs to step in so as to support them. Otherwise, there'll be mass-scale hunger and starvation and so on. So that additional expense is also there. So all told, the fiscal deficit of the economy is running at roughly about 30% of GDP at the moment. And if the government steps up expenditures to boost demand in the economy, it might go up to about 45% of GDP. That's of the lower GDP. Unfortunately, a lot of the analysts are still thinking of the GDP of last year. But if it's going to fall by 30 to 40%, that's the base on which the fiscal deficit needs to be calculated. That's the base on which the taxation needs to be calculated. And that's why a large number of analysts from IMF, ADB, etc., are not presenting the correct picture because they are still calculating on 200 lakh crores rather than on the 130 lakh crores on which it need to be calculated if the GDP is going to decline. So to say, basically the deficit of the economy. When it rises, it pumps in demand into the economy, and that's not inflationary in this period because there's already spare capacity, and that capacity can be brought forth. Secondly, when the world economy is in recession, then commodity prices will tend to fall, like we've seen the petroleum goods prices fall. Other commodity prices are also likely to fall because demand is short. And that's why you see in the Indian economy, the wholesale price is falling while the retail price is rising, And the retail price is rising because the trade margins are expanded. So all told, the economy is facing this new problem that, the prices of the wholesale are falling, the prices in the retail are rising. The fiscal deficit that should have been, boosting demand is not boosting demand because the private sector is down. So the economy is in a new normal. It's not in the situation that it was before January 2020. And that's why we require a different kind of thinking about the economy and how to boost the economy.
This is exactly what I wanted. I'm so happy that you pointed to this because, and I'm also happy that I have Professor Keen here because in an earlier program, I had a similar kind of discussion with him. So, Professor Keen, very quickly, Professor Kumar is also talking about a new kind of thinking, a new kind of configuration. The pandemic curve has been flattening somewhere. Somewhere it's still rising. At some point, the virus will have stopped its deadly march. But I think quite apart from that, there does need to be a lot of increasing numbers of economists who are talking about a new kind of thinking. Give us a very, brief sense of the importance of this inflection point and what exactly needs to be done.
I think the most important inflection point, firstly, is to realize that this is something which is only comparable to the World War. This is not your usual economic downturn, and to try to think about it as you would about, and it's about being responsible about government spending, etc., when the alternative is the death and destruction that goes with the pandemic. The only really comparable thing is something like a world war. And if I take a look at the level of government debt in the UK, which I have very good data on, when the Second World War began in the 1939 period, the level of government debt in the UK was actually about the level that Japan has now, 204% of GDP. That was in 1938. By the end of the war, it was 340% of GDP. So despite the fact that the debt level was far higher than it is now in the UK, it's currently running at about 100%, despite it being double that level, they willingly went to 3.5 times the current debt level. Why? Because the alternative was losing the war to the Germans. So in this situation, forget about worrying about budgets. Think about the purpose. You need to fight the pandemic. Ignore the level of government debt. It will take care of itself because ultimately, of course, in the UK's case, that debt level fell from 350% to 50% of GDP after the war was won.
Right. That's a very important point. Thank you so much, Professor Keen, for your insights. Before I wrap up, quickly back to Professor Kumar. A slight tangent, Professor Kumar. Given the state of the economy, as an economist and as a concerned Indian citizen, are you worried about the course that Mr. Modi's government is taking, both in terms of foreign policy debacles as well as this very ideological sort of Hindutva kind of approach to issues?
So, let me say the situation today is worse than a world war because supply has frozen and demand has come down. This is a situation that has never been faced before. So that's why I'm saying that we are headed towards a new normal where we have to think about different ways of education, different ways of, tackling consumerism, this deglobalization that is taking place, the supply chains that are going to be reduced by all economies because they don't want to depend on other economies. Now, it is in this situation of crisis that we need to focus all our attention on the economy and on saving the poor people. But the government is, involved in various other kinds of activities which are not conducive to a coherent policy framework. So I think what has happened is that we needed to tackle the lockdown better by focusing entirely on this. But, we could not tackle the problem of, of strict lockdown. Poor people cannot really lock down because they live 8 or 10 people to a room and they therefore cannot isolate. Also, they don't have essentials available, so they have to go out in search of food, etc. They have common toilets. They don't have clean drinking water. So where are they going to wash? So in other words, the lockdown in India did not succeed in doing what it was supposed to have done. And therefore, we are in a situation where the numbers are rising and we are relaxing. And that's why repeated lockdowns have had to be imposed in various parts of the country as the numbers kept rising. So the government needs to singularly focus on the pandemic and on its impact on the poor people rather than do the various other things that it is doing.
Well, thank you so much. That was Professor Arun Kumar speaking with us. Of course, the Indian government has just spent nearly $9 billion on acquisition of Rafale fighter aircraft. But that's a story for another day. At this point, we shall take a short break and return to discuss a Monday announcement by the Trump administration to further tighten restrictions on Huawei technologies. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about the announcement by the Trump administration to further tighten restrictions on China's telecommunication giant Huawei Technologies. The U.S. Commerce Department actions expand restrictions announced in May. They are aimed at preventing Huawei from obtaining semiconductors without a special license, including chips made by foreign firms that have been developed or produced with U.S. software or technology. The administration has also added 38 Huawei affiliates in 21 countries to the U.S. government's economic blacklist. This raises the total to 152 affiliates since Huawei was first added in May 2019. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross told Fox Business the restrictions on Huawei-designed chips imposed in May, and I quote from what he has said, led them to do some evasive measures. They were going through third parties. The new rule makes it clear that any use of American software or American fabrication equipment is banned and requires a license, unquote. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in a tweet that the U.S. government dealt a direct blow to Huawei and the repressive Chinese Communist Party by further limiting Huawei's ability to acquire U.S. technology and compromise the integrity of the world's networks and Americans' private information, unquote. Clearly, this is getting serious, so let's get right to our panel to see how this is likely to pan out. We have with us Thomas Donohoe, author of the CEO's Digital Marketing Playbook, as well as founder and CEO of Level Agency, and Sean Rain, founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, and author of 3 best-selling books, The End of Cheap China, The War for China's Wallet, and The End of Copycat China. Let me get to Mr. Donohoe here. Mr. Donohoe, is this really about security concerns, or is this about geopolitics?
With respect to the first move earlier this summer in terms of TikTok, that was primarily concerning the security of American systems and the potential weaponization of consumer data. So in that example, that was, I feel, less about politics and more about protection. This latest move, though, with a hardware manufacturer and a smartphone manufacturer like Huawei, I would feel, and I believe it's a little more punitive than a protective measure. That's my initial reaction.
Right. So let me take it to Mr. Rain here. Sean Rain, how do you look at this? TikTok, weaponization of data, but this one is more punitive rather than in terms of security concerns.
I agree with Thomas. I think both of them are very punitive. I mean, when you take a look at Huawei, is it about Huawei? Is it about IP protection issues? Is it about security issues? If it's about security issues, why is the UK saying that Huawei equipment is still going to be allowed to be able to be used in the UK until 2027? Does that mean the Chinese government and Huawei is still allowed to spy on the UK for the next 7 years? So spying is just a red herring. So is IP stealing, right? Huawei in 2019 purchased over $18 billion worth of goods. And that's why yesterday you saw the big American chip maker Qualcomm has been lobbying publicly, quite vocally, the Trump administration, or the Trump regime actually, to allow it to continue to sell chips to Huawei, because Huawei is a good player now. They might have stolen stuff 10, 20 years ago, but right now they are putting billions and billions of dollars into the coffers of American companies. This quite clearly has nothing to do with IP protection, nothing to do with security of the United States.
I love the way you say Trump administration. Well, actually not Trump administration, but Trump regime. But let me go back to Mr. Donohoe here. Mr. Donohoe, what would you say to what Sean Reyne is saying in terms of the security concern side of it?
Sean and I agree. Again, there are going to be actions and measures taken through the Trump administration by the FTC, the FCC, the Commerce Department. Obviously, they're able to affect regulations like this through the many tentacles within the U.S. federal government. But again, I think this is definitely not the last, and it's not surprisingly that they went after Huawei in this capacity again, between Apple, Samsung, and them being like the three giant manufacturers in the global market. It was an obvious, the target was on their back. So by no means, I don't think are any of us surprised. But what's fascinating in terms of the markets that my agency and I deal with on a daily basis, the advertising and social media markets or the search engine marketplaces, what I'm fascinated with is what's going to be the next step. So again, the Trump administration, through their branches within the government where they can provide more exclusionary policies. Again, in China, the Chinese population doesn't know what really Facebook or Instagram or Google look like. So the Trump administration can do two things. One, they can continue to punish China through ostensibly the blockades of their larger players or privately held companies, number one. And number two, they can do so under the guise of saying, look, China's been doing this all along. All we're doing is responding in kind. So what I'm fascinated with is, and I believe the TikTok clock in terms of when the Trump administration, it says you have to dissolve and sell your U.S. division. I believe it's September 20th. What I'm fascinated with, and what I think Sean will be interested in as well, is who's next? Who has the next target on their back in terms of a Chinese company or an interest that the Trump administration, prior to the November elections, what's going to be next? Because this is not the end of it.
Well, this is not the end of it, but does this concern you, Mr. Donohoe, as someone who, deals in direct response, digital advertising and the rest of it, and the fact that the digital world was supposed to be like the World Wide Web? I mean, a place where obviously you need regulation, but also a place which is egalitarian in many ways.
Ignoring, if only for a moment, the utopia that the internet could and should be, and social media, we do live in a real world with real decisions by countries and large players like this. So just from a consumer standpoint, and from if we're looking at what's good, more options for consumers and for the multi-billion-dollar global advertising market, being able to provide in this particular case, the Trump administration is really pushing for Microsoft. It's very unprecedented that they would not only take this action, a punitive measure against a Chinese company, but they would actually call out and severely, strongly suggest that a specific American company would be the recipient or the purchaser at a significant discount of the U.S. division of TikTok. So I think from a consumer standpoint in our marketplace, oddly, it would help consumers. TikTok right now, if they were to sell to Microsoft is the distant third place advertising option next to Google and Facebook. And frankly, from an advertiser standpoint and from a consumer standpoint, oddly, that would be a good thing from a U.S. and probably European market standpoint. But I do think there is, if that would continue to happen, the heavy hand of government into social media, there is going to be a point when it is adversely affecting the advertising ecosystem, consumers. But oddly, this particular move, TikTok being sold forcibly to a Microsoft, that would actually, to an extent, benefit our ecosystem in the advertising world, both in U.S. and in the UK and Europe.
Right. Sean Reyne, Thomas Donohoe has put a lot on the table. I want your response.
So I think who's next? I mean, that question is great, but it also shows that the Trump regime is trying to penalize China, because all of a sudden, in the 3 months in the run-up to the November elections, all of a sudden, almost every day, the Trump regime is going after TikTok. going after Huawei. Who's next? I think it could be DJI, the drone company, because they could pose a security risk. I think it could be Alibaba, because it could pose a security risk. Basically, what you're going to see over the next 3 months is almost on a weekly basis, Pompeo and Trump are going to target one Chinese technology company because they're trying to get votes. They're trying to scare the American public about yellow peril racism. The Chinese are coming. This is just like the 1950s with McCarthyism, but instead of some lone little senator, this is the Secretary of State Pompeo and the President of the United States who are sanctioning this type of witch hunting. So I think it's going to continue and continue and continue. Now, when you take a look also again about IP protection issues, which originally last year is why the Trump regime said they were going after Huawei. If you look at it, the Google CEO, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, all three of them said that they have never experienced the Chinese government actively stealing data from their companies. Only Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook said it's a problem. It's a well-known problem. It's a well-documented problem. And you know what? Within a week after Trump said they were going to ban TikTok, what happened? Facebook launched their own version of TikTok. So quite clearly, this is about protectionism and vote getting from the United States. And it's going to be very difficult for foreign companies to want to invest in the U.S. They just can't trust it right now. It's really a sad situation right now.
So leaving aside the technicalities, and you guys are the experts there, it seems to me that this is all about geopolitics and of course, in terms of not cooperative geoeconomics, but geoeconomics in a rival framework. Is that sense correct, Sean Ray? And I'm going to put that question to Thomas Donohoe also.
Absolutely. This is all about geopolitics. This is not about technology. The United States and China are starting to compete for who is going to be the next major superpower in the world. It's not about weapons. China cannot compete with the United States on weapons. The U.S. has about 6,000 nukes, while China only has about 300. The United States has military bases in over 80 countries, China only in one outside of China. So from a military standpoint, China can't compete with the United States, but it can compete with technology, it can compete with trade. And that's why the United States has gone after China on technology with Huawei. Whoever controls telecom in the future is going to be the major player, and they're going after China in the U.S.-China trade war on trade. So the two keys about who's going to be the next superpower in the next 10, 20 years, the two keys, the two areas is technology and trade, and that's where the United States is trying to pummel China and really cause fear throughout the world.
Sean Ray, and what you're saying, the implication is that it's not just the Trump administration, because if it's the United States, then even if another administration comes in, for instance, if former Vice President Biden is elected as president, the things are unlikely to change because that rivalry, that structure, because then we're talking about structural impediments here.
That's one of the concerns I have. I think Joe Biden is a sane person. He's not racist, but I don't think he's a quote unquote friend of China. I don't think we're going to come November or come January, if Biden wins, we're going to all of a sudden have a nice, peaceful U.S.-China relationship. This is going to be a real struggle over the next 4 years, regardless whoever is the president. When you look at it, Biden, when he was the vice president, he had more hawkish China advisors like Eli Ratner than the Obama administration. So I'm quite concerned that we're going to have some major tension and potentially a hot war in the next several years. I think analysts are underestimating the risk of a hot war. It might not be something that anybody intentionally wants, but you know what? The United States has been sending a lot of military jets near where I live off the coast of Shanghai. So what if two warplanes collide in the air by accident? What if two ships in the South China Sea get into an accident? We really need to have calm, pragmatic leaders, both in China and the United States going forward, because I'm worried we're getting close to a 1940s-like situation.
Well, you're talking about the securities trap, frankly. I mean, lots of people are talking about that. I just hope that doesn't come to that. Thomas Donohoe, your views on what Sean Ray has said.
Sure. Sean and I very much agree about the stakes involved in this bilateral escalation. Look, the Trump administration has no problems and has had no problems in the past 3.5 years destroying convention. And the concern, and I would second Sean's concern, I certainly don't think a Biden administration would be capable or have the propensity to have this kind of nearly weekly punitive measures against China. What I will say, though, what the Trump administration has been doing, it does set a precedent for future administrations. So that is a risk from just an escalation standpoint. So again, I do think Sean and I agree with that. I will say one thing, though, and this has what we spoke about before. There is a legitimate concern within the TikTok example that, Sean listed the two battlegrounds, I think, and there is a third, and that absolutely is consumer data, individual data, personally identifiable information, and how that is weaponized. Again, just in the United States or within Europe, and we saw what can happen from a purely weaponization of consumer data to affect the outcomes and perceptions of an election. So again, we are just starting what might be a generational long concern and reality in the future where our data and our information can be turned against us in very, very good ways from an advertising standpoint, putting the right product in front of the right person at the right time, to very, very bad ways. And I do think that that is a legitimate battleground that by no means am I advocating for what the Trump administration has done in terms of the forcing the hand of a privately held company, Chinese company granted, to sell to a U.S. company. But I do think there's an appropriate concern within the battlegrounds of consumer information and how and if it is protected. So I think, again, that third battleground, the conversation has been very obfuscated with, it's a geopolitical play, to be clear. It is a punitive measure by the Trump administration against, a giant, now a manufacturing company, but TikTok, that is China's ability to acquire, I think they've had 2 billion downloads of their app. So again, just the access to personal information is massive. And that battleground, I think we've just saw the kickoff in the past 3 or 4 years to what might be the next war of our generation, and that of my daughters. And I don't think it was done in a very, politically absent climate, but I do think we need to be aware of that. And I certainly don't know what the Biden administration would do within that battleground, but Sean and I would agree, this is certainly not the last swing at China from this administration, and likely whomever wins the next election here in the United States, there will be additional defensive and or punitive measures taken. But I would contend it's going to be more about personal information and how that is or is not weaponized by large social networks and media companies.
So, Thomas Donno, I'm happy you made this point. So, weaponization of personal information, the way it can be used to influence perceptions, poll results, the rest of it. So, why aren't we hearing about the Russians from the Trump administration? The entire burden of what were happening post last elections did not have anything to do with China, but involved the Russians.
That's just such a phenomenally good question, and it's dangerously baiting me into jumping directly into what I feel and what I'll vote for come November versus what I think the facts are capable of. What I will say is this: there is a perception backed with some data that the current administration did benefit from Russia's efforts purely on social media. So I'm going to be very careful to tiptoe around a direct commentary in terms of what I believe did or did not happen in terms of collusion or anything like that. What I will say is this, that has been and will likely continue to be through November, early November, the administration focusing on being tough on China, because that has a political gain. That's good political capital and fodder for the Trump administration. I don't believe the current administration benefits in any way from punitive measures against Russia and doing anything to turn the focus off of them from the base of the Trump campaign, and the Trump administration responds well to that administration being tough on China. And I don't think they benefit in any way, certainly not before November, in terms of turning possibly an appropriate gaze at what Russia has been doing. So by no means do I think that there isn't really good insight to be gained in terms of what the worst case scenario is for 2020 for a U.S. election, what Russia could or couldn't do with TikTok, could or couldn't do, or the Chinese, the Communist Party. What I will say is there is no way the Trump administration is going to stop focusing on China because that has political capital and gains for them.
It's true. Before I wrap up, President Donald Trump appeared on Fox on Monday and accused Huawei, according to the report, without any evidence, of spying on Americans. And the direct quote is, "We don't want their equipment in the United States because they spy on us." That's what President Trump said. But Sean Rain, so the Russians seem to have disappeared and the Chinese are center stage.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder what happened with Trump and the Russians. But I actually agree with Thomas when it comes to consumer privacy. I am quite concerned about that, but I don't view that as a Chinese thing. I'm actually more scared of Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg than anyone. I actually opened up a Facebook account last October for the first time, and the first friend recommendation was my 7th grade crush from 30-something years ago. I have no idea how they knew who my crush was when I was a 13-year-old, but somehow Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook does. So it's not a China thing. This is a Mark Zuckerberg Facebook thing.
Don't get me started on that Facebook thing, because you might have come across this report about how the Facebook is operating within India and not taking any action against people who are racist and Hindutva supremacists. But that is for another day. Thank you so much, Thomas Donohoe, for your insights. Thank you, Sean Rain, as always. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.